So welcome to Lesson 4 of this teaching series on game design and JavaScript. And in this lesson, we're going to recreate the famous millennial game Flappy Birds in just 55 lines of code. Now here's Don. He's the original creator of Flappy Birds, and at one point in his life, he was making $50,000 a day from in-app sales. Now, it took him several days to actually make the game, to code it, and to put it on the App Store. But we're going to recreate it in this lesson. And as we're going along, I'd encourage you to be thinking about what you would like to create, the sort of game that you'd like to make and mold and make your own. So to begin with, let's think about what we want to achieve. First, we want a stage or a context, just like the previous games that we made. We want a little birdie to flap about between these green columns which are being sort of thrown at us, which are moving as well. The green columns must move, so they've got to move across the screen. The green columns have to have gaps in them, so you think about how you're going to design this. There are different ways of doing it. Now the birdie itself should be able to move, and we're just going to make it simple. When you click the screen, the birdie moves up, and the birdie is being affected by gravity, which means if you don't click the screen, it keeps falling down. There's going to be some sort of scoring, and there's going to be game over. There's going to be a lot of JavaScript concepts, again, that we use here, some of which we've looked at before, such as event handlers. We're going to be using a canvas, the set interval function. We're also going to be using context, which is going to allow us to build this game in a far more straightforward fashion. In this lesson, we're going to make Flappy Birds in a single file. So we're going to do it in one simple index.html file, and we're going to embed the script, which is the JavaScript files, and the CSS. We do everything in one file. Now, in plain English, basically, what happens in this game is if the birdie falls down and down and down, he dies. If the birdie hits a block, he dies. And if you think about this mathematically, you might want to pause the screen and look at what's happening. But we've got a canvas size, we've got a bird size, we've got a bird X position, and that bird X position is sort of, stays the same, but the bird Y position is a starting position. It changes because it moves up and down, it's a variable, and that's the bird DY. And we also got pipe variables, so the pipe has variables such as 400, it has a width, it's got a gap, and what we're saying mathematically is we're saying if the bird, and that's the bird Y, the bird Y value falls beyond Y equals 400, which is the height of the canvas, the bird's gone off the screen and he dies. And if the birdie hits the pipe, again it dies. And if we're just looking at the top block, we're saying if bird Y is equal to the top pipe's pipe X value, then the birdie dies. Now again, this might be quite confusing for you, but if you come back to this and listen to it after we've done the coding, it might help. So again, in the same way, that is the code up here, which pertains to what we're trying to do. So if the bird falls beyond Y equals 400, which is the height of the canvas, he's gone off the screen. If bird Y is equal to the top pipe's pipe X, and pipe X is a variable that we're going to, which we've declared over here, then again the birdie dies. So we've got two conditions under which the bird would die. Now, if you are wanting to just get ahead and not listen to me type this out step by step and look at errors, etc., I would recommend that you actually did. It's useful to watch me do it, to do it with me. But if you'd like to go ahead, here's part 1. And remember, this is all in one file, so you can see that this is an HTML file. The script tags begin there, and that's the JavaScript. This is part 2. It goes down like that, and this is again all the JavaScript. The JavaScript ends there, and this is part 3. I can imagine that you're quite keen to just start coding and seeing how this works, but before we do that, just very quickly, we're going to go through some of the things that we'll be using, and you can come back to this if it doesn't make any sense now and listen to it then. So you're going to be using event listeners. Remember, you can remove an event listener by using remove event listener. This is all from W3 Schools, which is a great resource if you are just starting out, or even if you're an advanced developer, a great resource to come back to. An event listener is going to take 3 parameters which you can pass to it. The third is optional. So for instance here it's going to be a mouse down or a click or something like that. And the second parameter is a function. In our example, this is what it looks like. So we have an element which is going to be C in this context, as you'll see in a minute, and we have an event listener. The event is going to be click. The function is going to be this, which is basically saying the bird's dy value, and we're not going to be using that, so you can discard or disregard that. The canvas is something which we've been looking at, and it's very simple really. It's an element which is used to draw graphics on a web page. So the graphic to the left is created over here. This one is made with canvas. It shows 4 elements. You have a rectangle, a gradient, rectangle, and you can do various different things using canvas. It's used via JavaScript. And it's really, you can think of it as a container for graphics. You must actually use the JavaScript to draw the graphics. Context is something we're going to be using. And in our example, we're going to be doing this, var c, and we're getting an element by its ID, in this case the canvas, and we're going to be using context to refer to something like, say, a rectangle, etc. When we are using context, we're going to have canvas coordinates, and remember that the HTML canvas is basically a 2-dimensional grid, and we've talked about the coordinates and the computer coordinate system. So this is an example of, in the Flappy Birds game, the context that we'll be using, and you can see over here context.fillStyleGreen and context.fillRectangle. Again, this is not going to make any sense yet, but as we create it, it will start to make sense. And you can use this context to do all kinds of things in conjunction with the canvas. We've looked at the setInterval function, of course. In this case, we have a required function that we need in milliseconds, and in our game, this is the function in red, the milliseconds there in 10, which is 10 in this case for Flappy Birds, and we can ignore the rest. So to begin with, I think it's useful to actually play the game, which I'm not terribly good at, but you can see you have, if you mouse click, so I'm clicking the mouse, and that makes the bird go up, but if you hit the top, you die. If you hit one of these things, you die. If you're not quick enough, you die, and it is very difficult and quite scary. So you can see that that's how it works. If you don't click the mouse, the bird falls down and it drops down. So we're going to start coding this in stages, and we're going to begin by looking at how to just create the bird in the sky and scoring perhaps, and then we're going to look at all the complex features. So I would suggest that you began by creating a folder, as I have done, and I've got this image. Let's just show you what it is. It's a PNG transparent image, and if it's of any help, you can see if I open it up in Paint, it's 860 by 593 pixels. Now you can sort of adjust it here. So for instance, say I wanted it to actually have a white, say a yellow blob. You can make any adjustments. Write something on it. Anyway, so once you're happy with your image, and it can be something you've made yourself, you save it in your folder. And of course, I'm going to open up brackets to open up that folder. And you can see all it has in the moment is my bird. So I'm going to make a new file, which in this case is going to be an HTML file. And remember, unlike the other projects that we've done, where you've had a separate CSS file and a separate JavaScript file, we're just going to have an HTML file which has body, and when you want to add JavaScript inside an HTML file, all you need to do is add the JavaScript inside the script tags. That's it. So we're just going to have a simple one file, index.html, and that's going to be super easy for you to code and do different things with. So once we have our folder set up and we have our index.html, we're going to begin by setting up the body style, and let's have a height of 100. Let's set up a couple of variables here, and you can change them as you see fit. Everything text aligned in the center, which will be useful. And let's close that tag. you can see it automatically closes the body for me, which is useful. And now we're going to set up the canvas with an ID, and that's going to be C, which you're going to be constantly referring to. So remember that. You can give it a width and a height that suits you. And you can see again, it automatically closes the canvas. So we've got a canvas set up here. Now we're going to start coding in JavaScript. So we open up the script tags, we close the script tags, get rid of that little question mark at the end. And it's in between these script tags that we're going to do all our JavaScript coding. And we begin by setting up the context, which we talked about earlier. So we refer to our C over there, which is a canvas ID, and we get the context, which happens to be a 2D context. We live in a 4D world where Einstein's discovered that time is the fourth dimension, but this is 2D that we're working with. And then we create the bird. So if I go back down here, just for a bit of readability, my formatting is all over the place. Anyway, let's just do that for now. It seems to be naturally going there, so just see where it's going. Yeah. And I'm going to create the bird. So we're going to use a constant for that. The bird's not going to change. And we use a new image. The source of that image is going to be bird PNG. We're just referring to this little bird we have over here, which is a PNG file. So don't forget your semicolons, otherwise nothing works. We're now going to create the variables. Variables store value. And we're going to have various different values such as canvas size. It's good practice to actually, you could hard code them in as we're actually using the JavaScript, but it's better to have them set out so you can refer to them. So you can have a canvas size of, again, 400, a bird size, remember this is not CSS now, so you're using the equal sign, you're not using the colon. Now the bird X, the value, as I mentioned, of the bird X on the X-axis is always going to be 0. It's not really moving off, it's not moving across the screen in Flappy Birds, it's just moving up and down. So we have a bird Y value, which of course will start somewhere, say in the middle of the screen somewhere, but we also are going to have a direction. So like a DY, we can call it a DY value, which is basically the direction of the bird as it goes up and down the Y-axis. And this is going to begin, let's put a 0 in there as a beginning variable, initializing that variable, and we'll come back to that to talk about it. So we're also going to set up some variables for score. Let's do that here. Of course, the score is going to start at 0. We could have a best score and things like that. Let's now set up something. We don't have to do that if we don't want. And we are going to have an interval, which is basically going to be the speed at which the game is played. So you can play around with this interval to see what works for you, but I'm going to set it to 30. Now at this point, we talked about the set interval function, the method that we've used before. So let's have a look at how we set that up. So we have our parameters that would be passed here. So we have that set up, and you use that little arrow with your curly braces, and inside the curly braces we're going to set the context. So I'm going to say the context, and please do refer to W3 Schools, which is a fabulous resource. So if you're looking to do anything, if you think, I don't know how to do this, or I want to change this, look up context, fill style, fill rectangle, etc. And it gives you lots of ideas, so you don't have to be just copying me. So I would like perhaps my context to be sky blue, which is the background. And I also want to set up a few things using the variables I've already set up. So this is the canvas size over here. That's referring to that canvas size, which is just 400. I could have just typed in 400 here. And actually it needs 4 variables. So if you look up W3 Schools and you see what this is, fill rectangle, context.fill rectangle. In fact, let's do that. it gives you an example of what is going on. And if you try it yourself, you can see that you need 4 different values here. So this is giving me, you'll see very quickly as I change these values what these things mean. If I run that, you can see that that's giving me some sort of X value. This is giving me some sort of Y value. This is giving me a width. So if I made it very tiny, it would be absolutely tiny. And a height. So context fill rectangle, this is what we're using now. And you can see it takes 4 values. Ours is going to be 0, 0, and then it's going to be 400, 400. So the next thing, after we've set that to, which is basically drawing the sky, and you can see why it needs to be 400 by 400, it's just filling the canvas. We're now going to think about our bird. Now, our bird needs to have some gravity, because if we don't click, it's basically falling down. So I'm going to have a minus here, and I'm going to say bird by minus 0.5, and again you can play with these values to see what works for you. Finally, we're going to have, well, not finally, but we're going to draw the bird, and this is actually drawing or rendering the bird on the screen. So we put all the different, and again look up draw image, context, draw image and how it works, but we need lots of different variables here that we need to put in. Remember, I'm putting in these words, but they really refer to numbers. So bird x is 0, bird x is y is something, etc. So I'm going to say bird x, bird y, bird size, and we need another bird size there. And we're just drawing the bird. You can multiply the bird size by a number to adjust the size. So say when you've rendered your bird on the screen and you don't quite like the size of it, just multiply it by a certain number, it will adjust the size. We can look at that in a bit. So now we fill style, and that could be, say, black, context, fill. At this point it might be useful to see what's going on. And split the screen. Again, context, fill style, or in this case we're filling the text. Actually, let's fill some text. Let's write something on the screen. Maybe write Flappy Birds, and where would we like that text to appear? And again, this is referring to the X and the Y. And we do the same thing for some other text, like score. Where would you like that score to appear? First of all, it's going to also be referring to a variable. So in this case, I need to add a $sign. And say that this score is going to be constantly going up all the time as the player is playing. And where would I like that score, that label to go? Again, you can decide where you want it to go. And this is just XY coordinates. This is drawing the score. Now remember the set interval function? It's not going to work because it has one mandatory or essential parameter that you need to pass it, which is the timing, without which it wouldn't work at all. So I've set the interval here to 30. So somewhere here, so it says draw score. I'm just going to score that. Simple. It's on one line. And under that, I'm I could just write 30, but I'm going to write interval, and remember we are referring to this interval, this number here, 30. And we've closed our script. So if we save that, we can see something's happening, but doesn't seem to be at all working in the way that we want. So let's go back and have a think about what we might have done wrong. Now, one of the things that you will find that happens to you as you code and as a developer is just debugging is going to be the bane of your life. It's going to really annoy you. It's going to take time, but you have to remember it happens to everyone and you must not give up. Now, in this case, like I showed you, if I click the little flash there and we see that I've typed in the code, looks okay to me, but nothing is being rendered on the screen. And the reason for that is there's a tiny little error. Now, one of the most common errors useful for me to point out is a lack of forgetting to do a semicolon. So if you look through each of these and if you see that there's missing a semicolon, that would be important to add that there. But another one, which was difficult for me to spot actually, was in this one. So sometimes spaces matter, and this minus equals bird y. This is the gravity sort of function here, this variable, which is being drawn into bird y. So if I've changed that now, and I now refresh my screen, you can see that everything that I've coded has now appeared. So you can see Flappy Birds is over here, but if I do this, I'll make it slightly easier. And you can see that this Flappy Birds is being displayed on the screen. So if I moved that down to 300, just to show you what's going on there, you can see that that moves across to the right. So that is just the position. And again, in the same way, if I move that to 100, you can see that move down. So that is referring to the position of that text on the screen. In the same way, this score is being rendered on the screen over there, and I could move it maybe a little bit to the like that. That takes it up, and maybe actually I don't want it in the same position, but to the left, and you can see a score, and we'll get this to work in due time. When I refresh the screen, you can see that the Flappy Bird, just gravity is being applied to it, so it starts at a particular position. I could make it start anywhere really, so say if I said 300, it would be a bit higher up. And the dy position here is being manipulated, you can see, and that's the gravity. So we've got something working, we've got some basics, and now what we need to go ahead and do is add the pipes. We need to make little birdie sort of jump up every time we click the screen. We need to get the score working, and that's pretty much it. It's a very simple game, so let's get started with that. So we're now going to go ahead and do a little bit more coding. So we've seen what we've done previously. We've added the bird. As you can see, if I refresh that, you see the bird. We've added the text labels. We've got a blue background over here. All these variables have been set up. Now we know that bird x is equal to 0. That is basically the starting position of the bird on the x-axis. This is the starting position of the bird on the y-axis. And if you think about this is basically 0, and it's the movement to start with, which is essentially none. And we've talked about how that's the speed at which the game is played. We've set up some gravity. This is the set interval function, where everything is happening inside here. We're setting the context. We're drawing things like the sky. We're implementing gravity. We're drawing the bird. We're drawing the score as well. So we've got everything set up. And one of the things that we need to do, and we need to do that inside this sort of function over here. So let me just scroll up, or just make some space. And underneath where it says var interval equals 30, we're going to make or implement a little bit of logic which makes the bird go up. So at the moment, as you can see, if it's just falling, gravity is being applied to it, but we need it to go up. And a simpler way of writing it would be, you could actually use something like this. You could say C, which is the ID we're referring to again, on click is equal to now, for those of you who might be slightly more advanced, you will appreciate the elegance of that. So you could write that. However, if we want to do it in a way that is a bit more readable, we add an event listener with a click method. And remember, it also takes a function, and that function inside there, we tell it what we want it to do. In this case, it is that, and we're changing the value of bird dy. Don't forget your semicolon. So now we have a bird. When I click, it goes up. So the next stage is going to be adding the pipes. So I'm going to make some space here between the set interval function. Don't mean inside it, just outside of it there, and underneath this little bit of logic which makes the bird go up. And here we're going to add some pipe variables. Now remember, in Flappy Bird you have these green pipes which are constantly scrolling across the screen. We need to add these, and we're going to start by defining what they're going to look like structurally. So we have a pipe X. This is the starting position of the pipe. And remember, this is referring to the x-axis. Think of the other things that we're going to need. We're probably going to need a pipe width. And we could make that anything. We could make it 23, 24. Seems to be a reasonable width, as you'll see in a minute. Now, we're also going to need a gap between those pipes. And there are different ways, like I said, you could do it. You could actually make another pipe, which is a color which matches with this blue, or you could do something like that. But you could also just sort of define a width. So this is defining the gap width, as we'll see in a minute. And we also need to have a variable, which is, now this is confusing. Let me write the variable name and you'll see what it means in a minute. And I'm also going to set that to 24. Now this is the starting position of the bottom, that is the Y, of what appears to be the top pipe. And let's make sure that's a comment, so it's not part of our code. So in other words, we have the top pipe. I'm calling it top pipe bottom Y because it's the starting position of the bottom. So every pipe has a top and a bottom. This is the bottom of what appears to be the top pipe, because we have a top pipe and a bottom pipe and then a gap in between. So you'll see how that looks in a minute, and we can, once we have it visually on the screen, we can come back and analyze it. So once we've done that, we need to think about how we're going to actually draw these. So we've set up the variables, but we need to draw them within our set interval function. So we've got here, if I make some space, just move that up so we can see what we're doing. Got our set interval function, and you can see we've got the sky blue, we've got Flappy Birds, we've got the score labels, and now we need to actually draw the pipes that we've declared the variables for. So I'm going to type in context. Remember, this is how we create sort of visuals, and we want them to be green, these pipes. They can be any color you like. I'm going to use the fill rectangle, which we talked about earlier, and put in some of those variables. Remember, the variables, it needs 4 variables to be displayed on the screen. So it's going to have pipe X, which is 500, 0. We're going to have the pipe width. Remember, I could just put in numbers here. So I could just put in numbers, but it is useful to put in the variable name so you know what it's doing. And you can also change it more easily. And we have the top pipe bottom Y. Now this is actually drawing essentially the top pipe, what appears to be the top pipe. So now we need to draw the bottom pipe. Think about what that would look like. We use the same fill rectangle logic. We fill it in with these variables, but this time slightly different. Think about what I'm doing here. Just basically do a little bit of algebra and replace these words with the numbers and think about what they are displaying on the screen. So it's actually very, very simple. We also need a canvas size at the end over there. So this is drawing the bottom pipe. Now, of course, once we've drawn both pipes, we need to actually move it across the screen, otherwise we're not going to see it. So let's go ahead and do that. So if I type in pipe x, which is the x position of the pipe, and go minus equals, this is moving the pipe. Now, as ever, for some reason, we can see that we've drawn the pipes and they're not actually displaying on the screen. So we're going to have to trawl through our code to see if we can find some mistakes. I can see that this is the bit where I'm drawing the pipes. That looks okay, but I can see there that I've written topo pipe and that there's no such thing as that. So I changed that, and what you should see is you can see those pipes which are moving across the screen. So we've got something happening, we've got our pipes, they're moving. Experiment with these numbers. If I change that to 76, they move super quickly. So I'm going to keep that at 8. And then we move on to our next bit of logic. Now, here we need to think about what we're doing. We're saying if pipe x, which is the x value of pipe, is less than the pipe width, or the minus the pipe width, then we want to add a pipe gap to the top pipe bottom Y, which I know sounds really confusing, which is why you probably need to really draw this out for yourself and understand it. And then add a random number to that pipe gap so that we have a random gap at different points. So I'm going to write out some logic, and then perhaps that will be easier for me to explain it once it's done. So remember, we have an if function. The condition goes in there. And then what we want to do goes in within the curly braces. So I'm going to set the pipe x back to the canvas size. If this condition is met, it goes back to the original canvas size, whatever that variable has been set to, and then we're going to generate a random math number, which you do that by just saying math.random, and it's giving us a random number which is going to be for the gap. You can see now that when you refresh the screen, the gap which is generated should technically be randomized. That's what we're aiming for anyway. So let's keep going with some of this code. So if bird y is less than the value which is top pipe bottom y, and you can refer back to what that means. We're going to have these two lines here. Is greater than, again, now we have a slightly more complex function, top pipe bottom y plus the pipe gap, and we want to add to the mix if pipe x, the x value of the pipe is also less than the bird size. And we add that as well. And here, remember, this is an if function, so now this is the condition. So we need to make sure that that is closed. And then in between the curly braces, we define what we want to happen if that condition is true. First of all, we would like that to go back to 0. We'd like bird Y. If you notice what I'm doing, I'm just resetting it to its original values. And back to canvas size here as well. The score is also set back to 0. Oops. And we could have a little alert which says something like game over, which is great. We've already got the end of our set interval function down here where we've set the interval. So let's save that, refresh it, and you can see that we've got some major errors. So take some time, you might spot them before me to see what we've done wrong. We'll correct it, and we should then have a working game. So in this final bit, we're going to look through at some mistakes that we might have made. In this case, there are 2 mistakes. And as I keep mentioning, don't give up when you have mistakes. You've got to persevere, and actually you learn something from every error or bug that you get. Now, as you can see, it's not working at the moment. And the first mistake that I spotted was that I had closed the brackets too early. So remember, when you have an if statement, it starts with an open brackets and the whole of the condition is put into brackets. And I've actually sort of closed them there and closed them there again. So I can remove this bracket because the whole condition starts at that open bracket and ends over here at this closed bracket. So if I remove that bracket there, which was sort of accidentally put in, that would help. And you can see that now it works pretty much. I have Flappy Birds working, but there's one bit which doesn't work, and you can see the score is not being rendered correctly on the screen. So if I go up here to score, or down here rather, it looks correct. It doesn't look like there's any mistakes with it, but the only thing that I needed to change here was to use the backtick. Now the backtick is right underneath the escape key on your keyboard. So the backtick instead of a single quotation mark. And if I save that and refresh, you should see that the score is now working. So the score is incrementing as I go through the game, and as soon as the game is over, the score obviously stops. Now you can look up the backtick. There's lots of little functionalities like this in JavaScript, things, nuances that you need to just learn. I looked it up. There's the backtick. It's also called the grave accent. The usage of the backtick character. And I must mention Stack Overflow. It's an incredibly useful tool that you can use if you have a question, if you have a bug. And there's a community of developers that will be very pleased to help you. So there we have it. We've got Flappy Birds. It works. It's got collision detection. It's got a score being displayed with text being displayed on the screen. And the next step really for you is to think about how you could create a game from scratch using these basic principles. You could have a character. You could have your own kind of enemies or obstacles on the screen. You can think about the different ways in which you could display them. You could have a score. You could have different types of collisions happening with different objects. And you could even then go on, once you're confident, and make it multiplayer. Of course, one of the things that you can do is you can use our web design series. So if I go to maximize that and test and track, our web design series is a 0 to Pro web design series, which you probably should have done before you did this. It would have made it a whole lot easier. But if you haven't, do go through it, and by lesson 6, which is the one that you can skip to, it shows you how to actually host your website, which is what you've made, because you've made a web game on the internet. So you can use a variety of different tools to do that. One of them that we've suggested is a free web hosting service, but you can also use other ones. Ones like Fleek come to mind, Amazon, I think Google has free options, as well as GitHub. So do look into these, and we will do additional series which can help you look into hosting. So that's all for now, and it'd be interesting to see what you develop and how you go about making your own game using these basic principles.